Good evening. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Seattle University. I am Shane Martin, Provost at Seattle University, and it's certainly my great privilege to welcome you to tonight's event on behalf of our President, Father Stephen Sundborg, and the University. Tonight, we are very honored to have with us Representatives Suzan, DelBene, and Kilmer. And it probably isn't lost on any of us that we are in the midst of very, very important times. And so it couldn't be more appropriate to have an event that's entitled Impeachment and the Challenge of Bipartisanship. Very important, and I would even say prophetic type of event as we talk about what does bipartisanship mean in these contentious times. We know that many of our students, our faculty, and our staff live in the districts represented by our representatives that are here tonight. And we want to thank you for taking the time to come here tonight and to hear from your local elected leadership. Here at Seattle University, our students are known for their commitment to the community, whether it's through service projects, participating in enrichment programs on campus, or attending these types of special events on a rainy Tuesday evening. Events like this are valuable for our students to see our local elected leaders up close and to inspire them to continue to be engaged in their communities. As I referenced, these are historic and challenging times for our country. We're in the midst of impeachment proceedings, and the tone of the political landscape has become much more contentious, more polarized, more divided. And yet, even in these difficult and challenging times, we still see events like tonight as learning opportunities to learn more about our political system, to get ideas on how to build relationships, to remind us of the importance of contributing to our democratic processes and to our communities. So again, I want to thank Representatives DelBene and Kilmer for spending some time with us this evening. And it's now my pleasure to introduce the Dean of our College of Arts and Science, Dean David Powers, who'll introduce our guest. Dean Powers, thank you.
Thank you, Provost Martin. It's an honor to see you all here tonight. An honor to have our guests. This is an event, the conversation series here we've had now. I think we're in our 5th or 6th year. We've had remarkable speakers, people. It's been about hosting guests here to speak who've committed their lives and their careers to public service and who are really dedicated to addressing key issues, both for our community, for the country, and really for the world. So it's an honor to have both of our guests here tonight. I want to briefly introduce also our distinguished interviewers. Joni Balter, who is a multimedia journalist. She is a lecturer here and at the other university in town, and is a professional in residence here at Seattle University. Also, Larry Hubbell, who is the director of Seattle University's Institute of Public Service. And this event is co-sponsored by the College of Arts and Sciences and the Institute of Public Service. So I have the honor of welcoming and sharing a few words about both our guests here and a little bit about their leadership and service. Congresswoman Suzan DelBene represents Washington's 1st congressional district. She's number 1, as she will tell you, which spans from northeast King County to the Canadian border and includes parts of King, Snohomish, Skagit, and Whatcom counties. She's in her 4th term, serving since November 2012. She earned a bachelor's degree in biology from Reed College and an MBA from the other university here in town. She also worked in high-tech companies for about 20 years, including a position as vice president for mobile communications at Microsoft before moving into public service, serving as the director of the Washington State Department of Revenue. She now serves in the House of Representatives on the House Ways and Means Committee, also as vice chair of the New Democrat Coalition, and as co-chair of the Women's High Tech Caucus, fittingly. A few of her accomplishments include securing $200 million to expand job training opportunities, including $22 million for Washington, passing legislation to allow state, local, and tribal governments to implement community-based substance use diversion programs to address the opioid epidemic, and recently, as I read on her Twitter feed, fostering access to faster student access to student financial aid, which everyone in here deeply appreciates. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Congressman Derek Kilmer. He represents Washington's 6th Congressional District, including the Olympic Peninsula, most of the Kitsap Peninsula, and much of Tacoma. He was born and raised in Port Angeles, received a BA from Princeton University, and earned a doctorate from the University of Oxford in England. Prior to his time in Congress, he was a business consultant for McKinsey & Company. He worked for a decade in the Economic Development Board for Tacoma Pierce County before moving on to serve in the Washington State Legislature and State Senate. He's also in his 4th term, so you two started about the same time, it looks like.
Got me by a couple months.
I'm very senior. Yeah.
Oh, there we go, okay. He's the junior representative on the stage tonight. He serves on the House Appropriations Committee on the Interior Environment Subcommittee. I'd also say relevant to tonight's conversation, he's a member of organizations like the Bipartisan Working Group, which works to bring Democrats and Republicans together to get consensus on issues. And he's worked on the Puget Sound Recovery Caucus. He also worked with my representative, Congresswoman Jaya Paul, to get some money to convert one of the ferries from diesel to hybrid electric. So fascinating opportunity. Please join me in welcoming both of our distinguished House of Representatives members tonight.
Thank you, David and Shane. I'd just like to say it's a real pleasure having this event tonight. And, you know, we're talking about impeachment and also the challenge of bipartisanship. And one of the things we want to mention is that we did offer an invitation to the 3 Republican members of the House. Unfortunately, they were unable to attend because we really wanted this to be a bipartisan event. Tonight, what great timing about this.
Good timing.
I mean,
hard to predict these.
We've been planning this for several months so that it would occur right before the impeachment hearings. Trial is really amazing.
It could have been in the middle of the impeachment.
Right. So our event tonight, we're dividing into 3 sections. The first section, Joni and I will be asking questions of the members of Congress. And then we're going to have 3 members of the U.S. Congress class from the Political Science Department who are going to come up here and ask their own questions. And then finally, there'll be an opportunity for you in the audience to ask questions of our members of Congress. But before we go any further, I need to read a disclaimer. Very important from our lawyers. Seattle University does not support or oppose any political candidates. The views expressed are those of Representatives DelBene and Kilmer only. The Institute of Public Service is sponsoring this event. So with that, Joni?
So first, another thanks. Thanks so much for coming here. It's not exactly easy for you to get here. This is not in your district. It's really wonderful to have you on our campus here. So you both voted for impeachment, and that's all many people are talking about these days. But how hard was that vote for each of you? Why did you vote for that? And we'll start with you, Representative DelBene. Why did you take that vote?
Some of us were talking about Bill Ruckelshaus earlier, who recently passed away, an incredible leader in our country and who stood up at the time when Nixon was going through his impeachment. And someone asked him this question, and he said, actually, how courageous it was for him to take a stand. And he said, actually, it wasn't that hard. It was clear what needed to happen. And I feel the same way in a lot of ways. You look at the data, you spend a lot of time making sure you have all the information possible, and I thought it was a very clear decision. I feel the president has abused power. He has gone against his oath and betrayed his oath to the Constitution and to the American people, and has obstructed Congress. And so we never go to seek office thinking we're ever going to be involved in impeachment. It is a very sobering and very sad time for our country, but I think the information was very clear. And in the end, you have to look yourself in the mirror and say, am I doing the right thing? Because this is probably one of the most core things we do is swear an oath and make sure that we are upholding that oath. And for me, I don't think I could look myself in the mirror if I hadn't taken the vote I had, because I think the evidence is very clear.
Representative Kilmer, for you, was this a tough decision? What drove your decision?
Well, so first of all, I want to echo what Suzan said, in that I don't think any member of Congress shows up to impeach the president. That I didn't run for that purpose. You know, I represent a district that has had a lot of challenges economically, so my focus is on how do you create more economic opportunity for people and how do you get government working. And yet, the very first thing that I do in this job, that Suzan does in this job, is raise our right hand and swear an oath to uphold the Constitution. And it doesn't come with an asterisk that says, you know, when it serves my political interest, or with an asterisk that says, you know, depending upon what the Senate's going to do. It says, I will uphold the Constitution. And so as you looked at the fact base that came out during the impeachment inquiry, I thought the evidence was really overwhelming on two fronts. One, that the president asked a foreign government to dig up dirt on his political rival, which is an abuse of his office. And second, that he persistently obstructed Congress in that investigation into that first act. And what you had on top of that, on top of the evidence, was a bunch of credible third-party analysts. You had literally now hundreds of constitutional scholars who say these are offenses that rise to the level of impeachment. You have national security experts who have said the offenses as it relates to the Ukraine are a threat to our nation's security. And so in that regard, I thought it was very clear. Now, there were two questions that came out that I think every member had to think about. First off, you know, you heard from folks who said, well, this should not be about relitigating the 2016 election. And I think what was valuable, as you saw the course of the impeachment inquiry, this didn't have anything to do with the 2016 election. This wasn't about rebutting the 2016 election at all. You had people who then asked the secondary question, which is, well, why not just wait until November of 2020 for that election? And my reaction to that is, that would be a lot easier if the offenses involved didn't involve the president trying to influence the outcome of the 2020 election. And so at that point, it really becomes incumbent on us to take action consistent with our oath of office.
You know, if you don't take action, then you're saying this could go on again in the future. And so it is important that we stand up. It is our job as a co-equal branch of government to do oversight. And this cannot become the new normal. And so we have to stand up and call it out, or else it will become something that is accepted going forward.
I'd like to ask this question to both of you, and I'll start with Representative Kilmer. As you stated, there were two articles of impeachment that passed by the House. The Republicans, all Republicans, unanimously voted against that article, the article of abuse of power, the first one. And among the Democrats, it was unanimous except for two people who voted against it. For the second article, which was abuse of Congress, with what was the actual term? Obstruction of Congress. It was almost the same vote, except in that case it was solidly unanimous for the Republicans voting against it. And there were the Democrats voted for it with the exception of three people. One voted present and two voted against. And my question is, does this concern you that it became so partisan?
It does, and it is a difference than you saw under Watergate, you know, where as the evidence came out, you saw not just Democrats saying this rises to the level of impeachment. You saw Republicans as well. And I think it is concerning in part because what's at stake is the integrity of our political system. And the oath we swear is not to party, and it's not to a president, it's to uphold the Constitution. And I'm not going to speak for my Republican colleagues, I'll let them speak for themselves. I disagree with the vote they took, I disagree with their assessment of the facts, and I think it really, to Suzan's point, sets a really dangerous precedent. If you have to ask yourself, do you think it's okay for a president to ask a foreign government to dig up dirt on a political rival. And if you think it's okay for this president to do it, do you think it's okay for a Democratic president to do it? And I would say I would think that is not okay, whether it's Donald Trump or a Democrat. And it gets beyond whether we can look ourselves in the mirror. This is, can we look at future generations in the eye and say that we work to ensure the integrity of the American democracy?
And maybe a follow-up to what Derek just said. I am confident that if it was a Democratic president, many of my Republican colleagues would feel differently about what's happened. And that's heartbreaking, because it should be that we all agree across the board, as Derek said, that it is our job to uphold the Constitution. And so we should be coming together and saying this cannot be our future, and it should be a bipartisan effort. Now, there is one Republican who actually became an independent, who voted for impeachment, but he is classified as an independent now because he just felt like he could no longer be a Republican, so he changed. Justin Amash from Michigan. But generally, you're right. But I know that if it is a different scenario, I feel very strongly that even as a Democrat, if we're a Democratic president, I would have still voted the same way. But I think Republicans, in many cases, would be pretty outraged. And you can't say, oh, it depends on what party the president is from. It has to be, is this going against the Constitution? Is this abuse of power, obstruction of Congress? And I think the answer is yes, independent of what party the president is representing.
Representative Kilmer, another member of the delegation, Representative Denny Heck, is your roommate in DC. And something interesting happened in the recent months here during the investigations and the beginning of impeachment. He was quoted as saying that his soul is so weary that he is going to leave Congress. I think he's 6 terms.
He started with us.
Oh, 4 terms, right, okay. So he is going to leave Congress because, it's kind of getting to him. What is the impact on you? I mean, you live with this guy, you hear him talk sometimes. Has it had an impact on you that he's going to leave because his soul is so weary from this?
Well, first of all, I've put out a request for proposal for new roommates. So, you know anybody. But
he says you're the messy one, but...
it mostly bothers me because he stole my joke. But
Which joke?
Yeah.
That one.
Yeah, that one. Yeah. Listen, so Denny is in a really unique and really important position in the House, in that he serves on the House Intelligence Committee. And being able to observe the gravity with which he took this investigation and the amount of time he poured into it, you could see the wear and tear it puts on someone to have to deal with that fact base on a daily basis. And on top of that, the acknowledgement that, to the point of your last question, it didn't seem to compel our Republican colleagues, despite what is pretty overwhelming evidence of abuse of office. And listen, if you look up public servant in the dictionary, you will find a picture of Denny Heck. This is someone who has served our state for literally decades, and as a state legislator, as the chief of staff to a governor, and now in Congress. So he has a well-deserved, and his family deserves to allow him to have some time away from marble buildings 3,000 miles from here. But I don't think it should be a surprise to us that being on the front line in the way he was as a member of the Intelligence Committee, that would be challenging. And I have nothing but respect for the role he has played on that committee and the hard work he has done.
Representative DelBene, yesterday, Senate Majority Leader McConnell announced the Senate rules that apply to the impeachment trial, and they were amended slightly today. What is your reaction?
Well, you've heard, for those of you who've seen the discussion taking place today, one of the big core debates that's happened is, are we going to have a real trial, a serious trial, where people bring in evidence and argue their case? And Adam Schiff, who's one of the House managers, the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, who has been helping make this argument, said, you know, a trial means bringing people in. It means having witnesses, obtaining all the information you can. And the American public wants all of that information. They want everyone to be able to make an informed decision, not to predetermine their decision, to say, as unfortunately some senators have, they've already come to conclusion before the trial even started, but for us to have a real trial so that that's fair to the president and fair to the American people. The disappointing part for me is to see this ongoing effort, and it really is part of why you see one of the impeachment issues being obstruction of Congress, this ongoing effort to hide information. We're not having a discussion about, well, here are some facts, but here's how we dispute them, and here's other facts that we have to say, to bring up. Instead, there's been this ongoing case to say, we don't want to hear information. We don't want so-and-so to testify or so-and-so to testify, you know, Mick Mulvaney or John Bolton. We don't want them to testify. And the only thing you can think from that is they don't want them to testify because they're worried that it would hurt them. Why else wouldn't you want as much information as possible and available for people to consider? So I think the rules, unfortunately, have been about squelching debate, preventing all the information from coming to the table, and trying to move through this as quickly as possible to reach, unfortunately, what would be a foregone conclusion. And that is not what the process is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a true trial where we have that debate, and then people have to consider those facts and make a decision, just like Derek and I had to make a decision on our part when we were voting.
Representative DelBene, some Republican members of Congress think that we're about to see a slippery slope, that by doing this impeachment, and this was said years ago for the Bill Clinton impeachment, that you sort of make impeachment more likely by going ahead, as the House has done. What about that? Are we looking at a slippery slope because, you know, they're sort of more frequent in the last so many years?
I think, again, that we have to decide that it is our job collectively to uphold the Constitution, and if someone violates that, if someone abuses their power, Congress needs to act. And so I don't think it's so much about a slippery slope, it's about the facts of, you know, what actions have taken place. And I think that the president, we see more and more evidence coming forward even since the House voted. I think there's just a very, very strong case to be made about abuse of power. We continue to try to access information, and there was a lot of debate today about all of the information that the administration is holding back. If our Constitution also says that Congress is a co-equal branch of government, that our job is to provide oversight of the executive branch. If they can say, hey, I don't want to share any information with you, I don't want to show up and testify, how do we do our job? That gets to the fundamental part of our democracy. And so this really is about defending our democracy. And I don't think that's a slippery slope. I think that's incumbent on us to make sure we're doing a job to defend our democracy so that it can thrive going forward.
Representative Kilmer, I'd like you to put your political analyst hat on now. Now, I know you don't want to view this as a political exercise, but in your view, who does this benefit? Republicans, Democrats, or are both hurt by it?
I really don't see it through a political lens, and it's probably a better question for a political science prof or even a political science student than for me. I do think it's important to acknowledge to the previous question, because I've had this conversation with some of my Republican colleagues in private, and what I've generally asked them, if they say, well, it's a slippery slope, or this is such a divisive a process, and we're already so divided, you know, the general question that I have asked them is, so what level of abuse of power, what level of lawlessness do you need to see to be able to move forward with impeachment? And you know what I've gotten as a response? Nothing. I have not gotten.
You mean there's no example
There's
given?
no
There's no example of
there
what
really
would be?
isn't. And so my encouragement to you, if you're in these discussions, and I don't presuppose the politics of anyone in this audience, but what I would say is there is a fundamental question, and that is, one, do you think asking a foreign government to dig up dirt on a political rival is acceptable? And if not, then how does Congress turn a blind eye to that? Second, do you think that anyone in our political system should be above the law? I think the answer to that is no. And at that point, it becomes a requirement of us to move forward. And again, what I will tell you is, listen, I represent a district where 3 of the 6 counties voted for Donald Trump. And I kind of check the politics of this stuff at the door, because the oath that I take supersedes any political ramifications. And listen, we go to work every day on, trying to create jobs in our district. We go to work every day trying to fix this broken political system. And these issues got kind of put on our plate. We didn't go looking for them, to my chagrin. But if you turn a blind eye to these offenses, then I think it really sets a very dangerous precedent, not just for this president and not just for this upcoming election. Listen, the notion that you could have presidential candidates, including the current occupant of the Oval Office, continue to ask foreign governments to participate in an American election should not outrage you as a Democrat or as a Republican. It should outrage you as an American. We can't allow that to happen.
So was the slippery slope argument, I'm just curious, was that sort of like a talking point, or is that something that seemed to make headway for some people? They were like, oh, I don't want to, have every time we turn around another impeachment.
But I think the answer to that is then don't break the law. Like, that's not that hard, right? Like, do good things, right? Like, as my mom always said to me when I would go out in high school, make good choices. Don't break the law. You don't want to have more impeachments? Don't elect people to the White House who break the rules.
Representative DelBene, despite the fact that you don't want to be involved in this impeachment process, that you reluctantly are dealing with it, do you see it as having a corrosive impact on our politics in the long term?
It's definitely have an impact. Divisions are pretty strong, not only in not only in Washington, D.C., but even at home. People have strong feelings about these issues, and it was happening before then. We need to get to a place where you can have a healthy debate, and instead of saying to someone who disagrees with you, not only you're wrong, but you're a bad person, we've kind of gotten to that point. We need to get to a place where we can agree to disagree and respect that someone is coming from a different point of view. I think right now, as things have continued, and I think the president has contributed a lot by being very divisive, by, just even his tweets, the way he has, stoked, hatred of different groups, has driven division, the way he talks about even, different parts of the country or different groups in the country or different countries. It has kind of made that okay. And we've seen more and more folks feel okay to make strident statements, to say hateful things about others. And that has, again, contributed to division. Media has contributed because people kind of watch only what they watch what they agree with, and we don't see kind of that, kind of the old Walter Cronkite view where you had this kind of unbiased person who brought the facts forward, brought the truth forward, everyone listened and interpreted it. Now we have folks who go in their corners. So all of that is continuing, and I think has definitely increased during this period. And that's why it's so important for every single one of us to do what we can to break through. And Derek and I both represent districts that are diverse districts. They're urban, they're rural, they have places with more prosperity. We have old timber towns where they're struggling economically, where the politics are diverse. Derek talked about, counties that voted for Trump. When President Trump came to campaign, he came to my district up north by the Canadian border. I see, and you have the benefit of seeing those differing points of view, because I have a purple district. There aren't many purple districts left in our country.
When your district was drawn, I remember talking to the folks who were doing the redistricting around here, Senator Slade Gorton, and
He's my constituent also.
oh, that's right, and Tim Cease. And I remember Senator Gorton coming to the phone and saying that your district was the perfect swing district because it was
the most evenly divided in the country is what he said.
49.3 one thing and 49.4, Democrats or Republicans.
But don't you think our politics would be different? I actually love my district partly because of that, because I can hear every different point of view somewhere in my district. And that challenges you to really think about how you solve a problem that meets the needs of everyone. Everyone, not only in my district, but really is very representative of all of the different points of view across the country. But we don't have many districts like that right now. We have bright blue districts and bright red districts where people say it's one way or no way. And that creates a lot of the division that we see too, where people don't understand what it might be like for example, a farmer, and what it's like to be a farmer today if someone's in a city and hasn't had that interaction. And so the more we can bring people together to at least talk. Martin Luther King had a quote, I won't get it exactly right, but since we're celebrating Martin Luther King this week, he basically said that we have division because people don't know each other, and the reason they don't know each other is because people fear each other, and they fear each other because they don't know each other, and they don't know each other because they don't communicate with each other. So one of the biggest things we could do to help is to start communicating with each other, to reach out to the people we don't always agree with, break out of our bubbles, and let our ideas be challenged, and challenged back. But I actually find when I do that, there's a lot of things that we really agree on that we don't realize. And if we can build on those bridges, I think we'd be headed in a positive direction.
So, speaking of the big bad media folks talk a lot about impeachment right now because it's the big story, obviously. But I'm wondering, you folks surely check your emails and your calls and the call volume. Your staff comes to you and tells you, is impeachment the number one issue? I'll ask you, Representative Kilmer, is the impeachment the number one issue on people's minds, or is that a media misread to the point where there's other stuff? And if it's not impeachment, what are they?
So there's two ways to think about that. One is, when I go out in my district and do a town hall or visit a labor hall or a church or a small business or a Rotary Club or a university campus and say, what's on your mind? More often than not, impeachment doesn't come up.
And this is on this trip home as well?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, over the 3 days I've been home, right? But persistently over the last several months, what comes up is, issues around jobs and healthcare and education, and a general frustration and a desire to see government work better for people. Impeachment may come up, but it doesn't come up all that much. In terms of calls and emails, it's usually in the top tier, but that's people who are motivated to reach out to your office, maybe not the same representative sample as if you just show up at someone's civic organization. I want to touch, though, on, you mentioned, and I don't say this to sort of cast aspersions at the media, but you mentioned the media coverage. Undeniably, it is overwhelmingly focused on impeachment. And I think it's worth pointing out that sort of lost in this last year of coverage of the impeachment is the fact that, at least on the House side, we're legislating. The House has now passed more than 400 bills. More than 285 of them are bipartisan bills. In the week that the House passed articles of impeachment, you saw the House also pass H.R. 3, which was a really significant bill focused on reducing prescription drug prices. It passed one of my bills focused on helping coastal communities that are dealing with the impacts of climate change and rising sea levels to provide some assistance to not just coastal Washington, but other coastal communities that are dealing with the impacts of climate change. And you saw the House pass the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. And that was not present on cable news.
You're saying well covered.
Right. That was not exactly tearing it up. That was not trending on Twitter. All right. And yet pretty damn significant, right? And so part of our job also is to make sure we're talking about some of the things that Susan's doing and that I are doing to try to make people's lives better.
What about you? For you must get a read on the calls. You're out at the town halls, and you must check, volume of email. What are the people in the 1st District of Washington? Is impeachment their top issue?
It is an important issue, but I also agree with Derek. If you're struggling to put a roof over your head or take care of your family, put food on the table, then your worry is about today. Like, what do I need to do? I need a job, or I need help with services. What are we going to do to help me be back in a stronger place? Those more immediate needs are more important than impeachment and what's happening there. And we have, all of you know this, in our region, we have great prosperity, but we also have many people who are struggling and more kind of inequality economically throughout our region. And so those most immediate needs, we hear a lot from that. If you go out to talk to people, they're like, help me out because I need a place to live. Or we have an opioid epidemic. What are we going to do to help a family member who is struggling? I had a meeting today where we talked about the need for mental health and a focus on making sure we had mental health services. Those are hugely important issues. Healthcare is hugely important, especially if you're struggling with a health issue. So we hear about those every day. And I think impeachment sometimes groups come together to talk to us specifically because they want to talk about impeachment. And definitely in the calls and letters we get, people have strong opinions. But if we do a town hall and go out there, it is not focused on impeachment. I did a smaller kind of town hall type event earlier today, and there were more questions about impeachment, I think probably because that's happening right now, but that hasn't necessarily been true the weeks leading up.
Representative Kilmer, let's get to some specifics. Everybody talks about bipartisanship, but how can we try to achieve it? And since you mentioned healthcare as one of the main interests of your constituents, how could a bipartisan coalition develop around healthcare, like for example in the public option, or protecting people with pre-existing conditions? Is there an opportunity that you seek for consensus between Republicans and Democrats on this issue?
There's an opportunity. We haven't seen a lot of bipartisanship on the issue of healthcare, much to my chagrin. And I think that's in part, I don't say this in a partisan way, I think it's just a statement of fact. You've seen repeal of the Affordable Care Act basically become a litmus test issue for membership in the Republican Party. And as a consequence, you've seen a lot of dismantling of it by this administration and by the prior Congress. Neither of us were in the House when Congress passed the Affordable Care Act. I don't think it's a perfect law, but it is undeniable that it has made progress for a whole bunch of people in my district, and I would presume in Susan's district as well. The fact that there are literally millions of Americans that now have insurance that previously didn't have insurance, that's a really good thing. The fact that young people can stay on their parents' insurance until your 26th birthday, that is a good thing. The fact that preventive care and mammograms and cancer screenings and those sorts of services are now available without copay, that's a really good thing. The fact that people who have pre-existing conditions, and I have several in my family who have pre-existing conditions, now can't be denied insurance by an insurer because of that pre-existing condition, that's a good thing. And so where it becomes a difficult needle to thread is if your starting point is, well, we've got to repeal the Affordable Care Act. What that means is all of those good things that I just mentioned, you want to get rid of. And that is what happened in the House in the past Congresses. Thankfully, that did not pass the Senate. It is what the Trump administration is pursuing in the courts, a full repeal of the Affordable Care Act. And when we talk about a full repeal, it means repealing all of those things and others that I just mentioned. Your question is a fair one, which is, are there things, is there a path toward providing more access to quality, affordable health care? And I would argue yes, but only if and when Republicans get off the notion that you have to start by repealing the Affordable Care Act. My belief is we should fix the parts of the Affordable Care Act that need fixing, that we build on the success of the Affordable Care Act. Frankly, now we have to undo a whole bunch of the sabotage that was done to the Affordable Care Act. And some of these things just, and again, I don't say this in a partisan way, these are just sort of facts. So when the Affordable Care Act was established, there were components that were put into it that made sense. So for example, if you're bringing people with pre-existing conditions into the insurance pool, you're adding risk. And so there was something that was provided under the Affordable Care Act called cost-sharing payments to basically mitigate the potential risk to avoid premium spikes. When the Trump administration came into office, they said, well, we're not going to do that. If you talk to our state's insurance commissioner, he would say a very significant proportion of the premium increases in our state and around the country have been simply based on that decision by the Trump administration. Similarly, because the Affordable Care Act said, let's try to attach people into insurance who may not have had insurance before, they did a few things. So for example, they had a longer enrollment period, and they had something called navigators, where they had people who basically helped you try to figure out what insurance plan is right for me. When the Trump administration came in, they cut the enrollment period in half, and they defunded the navigator program. If there's political science students here, if there are public policy students in the audience, if you can tell me a public policy rationale for why that makes sense, I would love to hear it. Because I don't think there is one. I don't think there is any public policy rationale for a decision like that other than I want to dismantle the Affordable Care Act, which may be their public policy rationale, but I don't know how that helps the human beings who live in my district who just need quality, affordable health care. And so I know that was a lengthier answer than isn't there a path for Democrats and Republicans to work together on health care? Sure. And you mentioned a public option as an example. Listen, Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman said there are a lot of ways to get to universal coverage. He said the system that he thinks we ought to be looking at is the Dutch system, which he calls Obamacare done right, where you unwind a bunch of the sabotage that the Trump administration has undertaken. You set up a system of reinsurance and additional subsidies for middle-class and low-income families to be able to afford insurance, and you have a public option to try to create competition to private insurers to drive down cost. And, oh, by the way, in some regions where you might not even have a private insurer in the marketplace, you provide some option for them. That makes a whole heck of a lot of sense to me, and I think would be if we were looking for a path forward on healthcare, that would be a good starting point where we might be able to find some bipartisan support, but only if Republicans are willing to say, okay, we're done with the whole repeal thing, we get it, that's not gonna happen, let's try to do something constructive.
But something that I find surprising anyway is everybody has a relative who has a pre-existing condition. Pretty much everybody.
Most women are pre-existing conditions.
We're walking pre-existing conditions. So why does that not inspire the bipartisanship that should be gathering just around that one point?
The Affordable Care Act actually was bipartisan. I mean, if you think about it, not in the way you voted, et cetera, but a lot of things that are in the Affordable Care Act came from, work that happened in Massachusetts with Romney Care. The Heritage Foundation actually wrote some of the ideas that came in. So the idea, some of the ideas behind it weren't partisan. They came from bipartisan sources. what is so sad is, and with a lot of what Derek said in terms of this effort to undermine and just have to repeal the Affordable Care Act, is really because it's like it was your idea, and so I have to kill it so it's no longer anything having to do with you, so it can become mine. That's the antithesis of bipartisanship, and it has nothing to do with solving problems, seeing, my thing, which is kind of what Derek said in more detail, is look at what's working, what's not working, and who cares? Where are we today? Let's fix what's broken, and let's continue to enhance what's working and keep moving forward, because any idea that someone puts forward, it's hard. There are good ideas out there that may not work the way we expected, and we should continuously look at what's working and what's not working and move forward. But the impact of this idea that I can't support a bill because it was your idea versus my idea, that's the really toxic part that impacts this. It's not about saying, what are we going to do to help people with pre-existing conditions? It's like, I can't support this because it was someone else's idea. And I was doorbelling up in Concrete early in my very first campaign, and I went to a house of a gentleman who asked if I was a Democrat or Republican. I said I was a Democrat, and he said, well, then I'm not going to support you. And I said, why? And he said, well, I care a lot about health care. And we had this conversation. I said, so do I. And he said, well, no, you don't, because, the Democrats are doing all these terrible things. And so we started talking. And I said, well, do you think parents should be on their, our kids should be on their parents' plan until they're 26? And he goes, yeah, that part's good. And do you think we should cover people with pre-existing conditions? Yeah, I think we should do that. And I said, okay, and do you think we should make sure that that people who have lifelong conditions don't have caps where their coverage stops? And he goes, yes. And so we talked, and I said, actually, we agree on a lot. So there's got to be a path here for us to move forward. And we had a very good conversation, and I actually think, to my earlier point of people talking to each other, that if you take the politics out of it, and you talk to people, even people, the public, who may have partisan views one way or the other, folks want to see, it's not partisan to talk about pre-existing conditions. It's partisan in this strange world where folks are focused on winning a political point versus solving a problem for the American people. And our job is to solve things for the American people. That's the part of our politics we have to change.
On the plus side, Representative Kilmer, you're the chair, and I know that you're on this committee to modernize Congress. It probably has a better title than that, but
no, that's actually the title.
Okay, well, there you go. And
Kind of a bummer title.
which implies
I'm pretty sure
it's
our
not
chair
very
came up
modern.
with that title.
It must have been the chair, I'm sure. But here we have impeachment. You go to these meetings. I don't know how frequent they are. I think I looked on the website, and one wasn't that soon scheduled, but how does impeachment impact the ability to do that work? And you can probably explain a little bit of what you're trying to achieve with that group.
So let me zoom out for a second and talk about give a little sense of what we're talking about. So about every 20 or 30 years or so, Congress realizes things aren't working the way they ought to, and they create a committee to try to fix it. This year's committee is called the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. I know, super catchy. And Suzan and I both got asked by the speaker to serve on this committee.
It's very Washington State heavy.
It's very Washington State
We're very
heavy.
modern.
But it was tasked at looking at a handful of things, all in the service of how do you make Congress function better on behalf of the American people? So looking at things like rules and procedures, looking at the schedule and the calendar, looking at how Congress uses technology to solve problems, looking at how do we recruit, retain, and have a more diverse staff to solve problems for the American people. We've looked at things like civility, and I will confess, so when we got this assignment, the first thing I did is looked at the history of these select committees. And what I found was they all stunk. They, by and large, didn't accomplish a whole lot. So in modern history, in the last Congress, there was a select committee on budget and appropriations process reform, which passed 0 recommendations. Before that, there was something called the Super Committee, which was looking at debt and deficit reduction. It passed 0 recommendations. You can go all the way back to the 90s, when I was in college, before you can find a select committee that has passed any recommendations. So when we got this assignment, my first reaction was, oh crap, what did I do to piss off the Speaker of the House to get put on this committee? But we've decided to do something a little bit different, and made even more unusual in the context of a very divisive political year where we're undertaking impeachment. And that is, usually when one of these committees gets formed, the first thing that happens is the committee gets its budget and you divide by 2, and the Democrats get their half of the money, and they use their half to hire Democratic staff of people with Democratic backgrounds who put on blue jerseys, and then the Republicans use their funds to hire Republican people who put on red jerseys, and then they spend the next several months trying to beat the crap out of each other. That's a legislative technical term. We decided to do something a little bit different, and that was, I said to my Republican colleague, not my ranking member, my vice chair, Tom Graves, so what if we don't do that? Like, we don't have a lot of time and we have too many problems to solve. What if we just do this together, right? And what if, for example, we hire a bipartisan staff, and some will be Democrats and some will be Republicans, but they'll all put on jerseys that say, let's fix Congress. And rather than sitting with Democrats on one side of the dais and Republicans on the other side of the dais, like, what if we just kind of mix it up a little bit and like focus on the problems we're trying to solve rather than just duking it out the whole time? And what if when we have a hearing where we discuss some of these problems, we try to think through solutions together? And on technology, for example, you have someone who's an expert like Suzan DelBene, who worked at Microsoft, working with Rodney Davis, who's a Republican from Illinois, coming up with solutions. So why do I mention this? Because we've taken a different approach, we have, before the last year ended, we passed 45 recommendations. All of them were unanimous. It's the first select committee.
What's the best one?
There's a lot of good ones. So if you ask me, like, how do you fix Congress? There's not a silver bullet, right? It's more like silver buckshot. There's a whole bunch of stuff you've got to do. And some of it's like little stuff. So I'll give you a quick example. This may be not the most consequential, but it's most indicative of the problems. So when you show up for freshman orientation in Congress, we have freshman orientation too, just like you guys. So literally, they sit the Democrats on the Democratic bus and the Republicans on the Republican bus. And orientation is, by and large, they segregate you by party throughout the orientation process. So literally, from the beginning, you are put into separate camps. And so it's no wonder that it becomes such a crap show once you have to show up and do your job. And so, again, sorry, that was also a legislative technical term. So one of our recommendations was stop doing that, right? Let's look at the orientation process as a professional development process for new members of Congress, not an opportunity to tribalize Democrats and Republicans into separate tribes. That is an example of one of 45 recommendations.
So you mentioned that Representative DelBene works on technical matters, and so she has introduced a data privacy bill. As we know, as many people know, California passed one for its state, thinking you guys weren't going to get to it. Washington has a bill in the works.
And we haven't yet. So.
And Washington has a bill in the works as well, second year, I think. But is that an area for bipartisanship?
It should be. I actually think on a lot of our issues of technology, it's not that they aren't bipartisan, it's that people don't understand them and they're afraid to take a position. So I think there's a huge opportunity for us to move bipartisan legislation. I was on the Judiciary Committee early on. We had bipartisan legislation to address an issue that, well, let me go back a step. We should protect our civil rights, human rights, our civil liberties, our constitutional rights in a digital world, and they aren't always protected. For example, this piece of paper that Joni has, if law enforcement wanted to get it out of her desk drawer, they would need a warrant. But if it was actually in an email that's over 90 days old in the cloud, don't need a warrant. It's considered abandoned for a lot of obscure reasons about legislation that was written back in 1986, long before anyone was really using email. I worked on email in Microsoft starting in 1989 when you could send email to the person in the office next to you. And that legislation was written before then. So the warrant standard, this very basic constitutional right, it's not protected in a digital world. Law enforcement can access your email in the cloud. Well, we had bipartisan support to write a bill. It's called the Email Privacy Act, very simple. Passed it in the House in a Republican Congress twice. The Senate never took the bill up. And so this is a place where I think there are huge opportunities, but a lot of education is necessary because not all members of Congress are very technology savvy, and so I've developed a few bipartisan groups to the Internet of Things Caucus, the Digital Trade Caucus, the Reality Caucus, which deals with virtual, mixed, and artificial reality, all these places where we can bring members together, help educate them on these issues so they're better prepared to help introduce legislation that protects us in a digital world.
Well, that's our last question, and I'd like to invite the three students from the U.S. Congress class, Emily Connell, Kyle Politz, and Will Stein, to come up here.
All right, so my first question is, according to the Associated Press, there were no Republican Congress members who voted yay on either Article 1 or Article 2 during the vote. Is it possible that this is a result of partisanship, or is it also equally possible that Republican Congress members also voted in favor for what their constituents would have wanted?
I think we talked about this a little bit before in terms of it. I think, once again, this is an important individual decision that each member of Congress has to take and respect their oath. Everybody's district is very different, so people might have districts that have, where the population has a different opinion. I actually got a question earlier today at a meeting I was at where someone said, is it what you think is the right thing to do when you vote, or are you supposed to represent your constituents? So, in a sense, do I go out and I poll my constituents to have them tell me what the answer is? And, as an elected official, people elect us to do our job of taking information in and make the best decision possible for our district, not just to go out and say, tell me what you want the answer to be, like some type of algorithm. And I think this is one where it's incumbent on all of us to respect our oath to the Constitution, to understand the facts, and to make a decision to do the best thing to represent our districts and our country. And so, for some people, once again, they may agree, but I think the facts are pretty strong, and I think that it's important that for all members of Congress to look at those facts and make a decision. And as Derek and I talked about earlier, this can't be the new normal for our country.
Okay, so this is a question from...
Put the mic up a little closer.
Sorry, okay. So this is a question from Congressman Kilmer's website. I bet it's for both of you. Okay, so how do you plan to boost bipartisanship in order to tackle problems like ocean acidification and help guide the country away from fossil fuels when so many communities and livelihoods are built around those industries? What support will be offered to those negatively affected by those changes?
Yeah. So, one of the things I know we got to talk a little bit about was that there are efforts in Congress to try to have some of these tough conversations. I chair a group in Congress called the Bipartisan Working Group, which is a dozen Democrats and a dozen Republicans who meet for breakfast every week. And it's sort of a meeting in three parts. The first part of the meeting, we go around the room, and anybody who's working on something where they want to make a pitch to talk about something they're working on is given that opportunity. And in fact,
So it's a deal making.
What's that?
It's some good old-fashioned deal making. No?
Well, it's trying to expose each other to our ideas and to things that we're working on. So I just introduced a bill that was focused on financial aid and specifically looking at federal work study. And I'd been working on it, and I made a pitch, and Susan Brooks, who's a Republican from Indiana, said, I would work with you on that, and now it's a Kilmer-Brooks bill. Second part of the meeting, we talk about what's going on in Congress that week, and those can be feisty conversations, right? If you're talking about healthcare or taxes or impeachment, people can have sharp elbows, but I'm increasingly of the belief that good democracy is a little bit like a good relationship. You know, you don't necessarily agree with your partner on everything, but you got to be able to talk to each other and listen to each other and not have everything turn into a fight. And then the third part of the meeting, we talk about big, hairy issues facing the country. And to the point of the question, we've had those dialogues about climate change and about climate policy and where we might be able to find some common ground. And it's not like we're holding hands around the table and singing Kumbaya or, you know, closing our eyes and doing trust falls into each other's arms. We stopped doing that after we dropped a guy, but it's sort of the hour of each week where I find myself thinking we need to be doing more of that as a country. On the issue of climate specifically, there's, interestingly enough, another caucus that's called the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus. It's been nicknamed the Noah's Ark Caucus, in part because of I think, the threat of biblical flooding, but also because you can only join it in pairs, one Democrat and one Republican. And what I found is it's been really useful, one, to try to get a common fact base, to have a common starting point. So, you know, I represent a district that has 11 Native American tribes. 4 are coastal tribes that, as we sit on this glorious campus, are in the process of trying to move to higher ground because of persistent flooding from rising sea levels, not to more severe storms, and not to mention the threat of tsunami. You know, we saw a fire burn in my district for weeks and weeks in the rainforest. You know, the largest employer in my district is the United States Navy. The Defense Department looks at climate change as a threat multiplier. And turns out most of our naval bases are built like on the water. And so that is a threat to them. And so you start to have these conversations with our Republican colleagues. So, you know, I have 3,200 people in my district whose jobs are tied to shellfish growing and to fisheries. And they look at this as an existential economic threat if we fail to do something. So interesting enough, one of the bills that the House has passed, one of the bipartisan bills that we have passed, is a bill that I'm the lead sponsor of called the Ocean Acidification Innovation Act. And it's co-sponsored by Republican, Joni Balter from Southern Washington. And you know why we were able to work on it together? Because she has a bunch of people whose jobs are tied to fisheries as well, and to shellfish growing as well. And so we're trying to start with looking at some of these discrete problem statements and identify, one, how do we take action to combat climate change and the impacts of climate change? I believe the scientific consensus is very clear. One, that climate change is real. Two, that it requires big, bold action. And the scientific consensus is clear that we need to get to net zero by 2050 at the very latest, if not sooner. And then secondly, though, as we deal with that, we also have to acknowledge that we don't want to leave communities behind and we don't want to leave people behind. And that's personal to me. I grew up in Port Angeles. We saw the impacts of disruptive economic change on my hometown. And I think it's really important that as we put forward climate-forward policies and develop a clean energy economy, that we're working to ensure that we're not leaving communities behind, that we're making investments for them too. Just this very simple issue of climate policy. Yeah.
I mean, I think the key part is a little bit of the last part that Derek was talking about. We have a huge sense of urgency that we have to move now. I was a bio major in college and started my career doing biomedical research. I feel, these are issues where it's frustrating because I think the science is overwhelming. We're talking about facts, where I think the evidence that we see just day to day as people in terms of what happens should make this even more sense of urgency throughout our country. So this is a tough one because while we are making some small steps, we need to make very large, significant steps. We are way behind, and so we can try to work forward in the areas like Derek is talking about, but we need to do something much bigger than that to address what's happening not only here but around the world, and that's going to mean that we and it should also be very bipartisan in terms of this effort. And so it has been more of a challenge because we haven't had sometimes even folks who are willing to acknowledge that there's anything that we should be working on. And that's not just in Congress, it's also the administration, and the administration rolling back, even pulling out of the Paris Agreement. These are all things that have had a huge impact, and we need that outcry to be strong in a bipartisan way if we're going to make a difference.
After this question, we'd like to ask the audience to come to the front here, not on stage, but to the front, and ask any questions you may have.
So my question is, why do you think that emoluments violations for failing to divest from personal businesses and for war crimes in Yemen, for example, were left out of the articles of impeachment?
So I think you have to start with the recognition that there was a reticence in the House, and clearly you're seeing that reticence in the Senate, to move forward with impeachment in the first place. I think you saw sort of a crossing of the Rubicon when the information was brought forward by the whistleblower with regard to the president's action pertaining to asking the Ukraine to dig up dirt on a political rival. I think that was really a game changer in terms of having members of Congress say, okay, that is crossing a line. And that's not to say that there aren't legitimate concerns about the other issues that you raised. I think both of us have raised concerns about the president's self-dealing, and you all should have a confidence that the people who are representing you are making decisions in the public interest, not in their own personal financial interest. I think what you've seen in the House is an effort to approach that issue from a different way. The very first significant bill that the House brought forward was called H.R. 1, the For the People Act. And it was really designed to restore public integrity, both through very substantial campaign finance reform, but also through ethics reforms for the legislative branch and for the executive branch to make sure that type of self-dealing couldn't occur.
Anybody want to come to the front? If not,
Here we can handle this.
okay.
Hi, my name is Graham. I'm a sophomore here. So you talked earlier about how the Senate rules leave out a lot of information and a lot of evidence, but obviously the House had the chance first to look at all that evidence, and so I'm wondering why it kind of felt like a rushed process, and so I'm wondering why so many conspirers weren't interviewed, and why so much evidence, obviously evidence, continues to come out, so why all that was left on the table and why you voted without that information.
So it was not without effort to bring those witnesses forward. In most instances, the administration sought to block those witnesses from testifying. And then the House had to make a decision because they were up against what would be a pretty lengthy court process to determine whether or not those people were compelled to testify in the face of a legal subpoena. The same thing with regard to the availability of information. This is why one of the charges is obstruction of Congress in the process of that investigation. If you look at, and there's been a little bit of conversation about the Watergate process that happened in the 70s, after Watergate occurred, you saw the Congress take up what was really a series of reforms in reaction to Watergate. And I don't presuppose what's going to happen in the Senate, but I can tell you my sincere hope is after this process is over, you see Congress look at some of the problems that were created where you really have, in what is designed to be equal branches of government holding each other accountable, some really significant loopholes where an administration can block people from testifying and you have a court process that could go on interminably. that hamstrings the ability to do the investigation and the oversight that under our Constitution, the Congress is tasked with doing. So my hope is that you see some of those reforms. To your second point, even in the absence of those people testifying and some of that information being provided, I thought there was clear evidence simply from the people who were allowed to testify or who ignored the president's admonition not to testify. Based on that information alone, I thought it was compelling enough to support the articles of impeachment.
And we still see information coming out, Lev Parnas and all the information and documents that came out there. But absolutely, if folks refuse to either testify, refuse a subpoena, if our own federal agencies won't provide Congress with documents, we are, hence the obstruction of Congress side. This is a place where we have to, we had data, which is important, I think made the case to Derek's point, but there is still more information out there, and that information should be available to the public. There's no reason we shouldn't have that information, and the Senate should be doing its part as well in terms of trying to get whatever information as possible, and they could. And unfortunately, it looks like they're going to do everything possible to avoid that.
So Emily, Kyle, or Will, do you have another question you'd like to ask?
I actually do have one more question. So Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell stated that if the impeachment trial were to move forward to Senate, he would not be an impartial juror because the House was not impartial. McConnell argued that the decision to impeach Donald Trump was a political process instead of a judicial one. How do you respond to this? And do you think that the impeachment was more of a political process than it was a result of the president violating laws?
I think in the House we went through a process to make the case and vote on the articles of impeachment because the president did violate the law, both in terms of abuse of power and then also in terms of the obstruction of Congress. So I think that was the case that the House put forward, and now it is in the Senate's hands. And he took an oath. I mean, all of our senators were sworn in. They took an oath to be impartial jurors. So I don't know how you can take that oath and say you've already made up your mind. And that's a question a lot of folks have asked. He's not the only senator who came out and said that they already had an opinion, but his job is to look at the facts, and if he looks at those facts and decides whatever he might end up deciding, he should go into it as based on the oath he took to be an impartial juror, and he should be doing everything possible to get every piece of information he can to inform that decision. I mean, I think that's what we all want. A fair trial means getting all of the information, and I think the biggest case to be made against the administration is they have done everything possible to avoid arguing facts. They've done everything possible to avoid information coming forward. If you want to prove yourself and make a case for yourself, you want folks to go out there and say, see, I want you to read this document which shows that X isn't true or Y isn't true, or I want you to talk to this person who can provide more information that's critical. The administration is doing everything possible to avoid more information coming out. So they are absolutely trying to prevent transparency in this case, which is not necessarily the strongest way to try to prove your innocence.
You want to go rock, paper, scissors?
This is Seattle four-way stop. You go.
All right, so this is a question from Congresswoman DelBene's website. I'm going to get this for both of you guys. So you spoke about how Congress must come together in a bipartisan fashion in order to find a long-term budget solution. This feels like a recurring issue, and how do you plan to make sure that Congress, quote, stops kicking the can down the road and therefore setting up future fiscal crisis?
Well, I serve on the Ways and Means Committee, and we are the committee that has jurisdiction over taxes and revenues, and so this is a conversation we have a lot, because in the end, we have to pay for things. And especially at this time where we have our country overall, clearly we talked about income inequality and how not everyone is prospering. While we've had a time though of general economic prosperity, we should be getting our fiscal house in order. We should have been on a path of reducing deficits, making sure we have a strong fiscal balance sheet so that we're ready for the next time when the economy turns, which will come. Right now, we are in the middle of fiscal year 2020. Started on October 1st of 2019, and we didn't pass. We didn't have our spending bills done. Derek serves on the Appropriations Committee. The House did their work, but the Senate didn't pass it. So in the end, we ended up starting the fiscal year doing something that we call continuing resolutions, which is the kicking the can down the road part, where we just keep funding the government at the levels we set the last year, and we keep it going, and we keep it going for a few months at a time until Congress gets its work done. Well, we always know when the fiscal year starts. It starts October 1st every year. So there's no reason we shouldn't get our work done in time. Yet the amount of time we've been in Congress, it's more likely that the spending bills haven't been done across the board in time, and we've had shutdowns. We've had times where we do these continuing resolutions. It is the most expensive and inefficient way to budget. So there's one thing. The Senate can't just say, oh, we're not going to do it. There should be a responsibility to get that done. And second, when we talk about overall how we're moving forward, we've got to talk about where the money is coming from to invest in the projects that we care about. And some things give us a great return, like infrastructure, education. Sometimes we make long-term investments that give us a great return. We've got to talk about where that money comes from. If you look at, for example, infrastructure right now, a conversation we're going to be having again in Congress, we used to rely on the gas tax to pay for transportation. Turns out you used to drive your car, and gas tax was a great proxy because you spent more on gas if you drove more. But now we have alternative fuels, we have more fuel-efficient vehicles. It doesn't work as well as it used to. But we haven't come up with a new way to pay for infrastructure. So we've raised the gas tax over time to try to get as much money out of it as we can at the state level as well. But in the end, if we really want to invest in infrastructure, we have to come up with a new way to do that. We have to have these conversations. We can't be in a situation like we were last Congress, where all that went through was a highly partisan tax bill that cut taxes for the wealthiest among us and ended up in a situation where our deficit and debt increased tremendously. And instead of helping move forward in this way, we've moved backwards. We've got to be realistic and those are probably some of the toughest conversations we could have in Congress about where money goes. Derek's on the spending part, I'm on the revenue side. Those are probably the toughest areas and conversations we need to have, but are incredibly critical to addressing that issue. And if we aren't having bipartisan conversations, we end up in a place where we have government shutdowns or partial funding for a few months at a time, which is not at all moving us forward on this. So that has to be a priority and effort, and it's got to be something all of you value so that we tell elected officials we need them to be working on these issues.
I mean, I think substantively, Suzan hit the high points. The only thing I would add or maybe amplify is that bad process yields bad outcomes. You see where Congress kicks the can, does these continuing resolutions, or has a government shutdown. And I represent a district where the largest employer is the federal government. It's the Navy, it's the Park Service, it's the Veterans Administration. And so it really hammers those federal workers when we have a government shutdown. It's really bad for, so I grew up in Clallam County. When the national park shuts down for weeks and weeks and weeks, if you're a hotel owner or a restaurateur or a small business owner, it really hammers even private employers in counties that frankly can't afford that kind of hit. And so what then generally happens is Congress is negotiating something at the very last minute or well past the last minute in the midst of a government shutdown, and generally ends up having to vote on something where it's either a bill that doesn't always make all the right choices, or if you vote no on that, we can continue to have a government shutdown. And so bad process yields bad outcomes. And so one of the things that Suzan and I on this Fixed Congress Committee that we both serve on are talking about are some potential reforms to that process, so that if Congress can get out ahead of the problem, if there can be, for example, as we see at the state level, a 2-year budget resolution and then annual spending bills rather than, right now things fall apart really early in the process. I mean, we won't, it seems, even do a budget resolution this year in Congress, which is fine because it's largely a political document anyhow. It hasn't really informed spending decisions. And so we're really trying to get at this question of how do you have a process that works better for the American people that can yield better outcomes? There's a whole other list of problems related to the budget. And Suzan touched on the tax bill. Rule number 1 in getting out of a hole is stop digging. And having a tax bill that blew a multi-trillion-dollar hole in what was already a giant hole, with most of the benefit going to super rich people, I think made 0 sense.
Thank you.
So we touched on it briefly about how it appears that some senators have already made up their mind on how they'll be voting. And that leads people to believe that it appears that the president will not be acquitted in the Senate, or will be acquitted in the Senate and not removed from office. Do you worry that this potential acquittal will embolden the president to continue to do the same things that got him impeached in the first place with no legal or political repercussions?
I think every American should be concerned about that. I mean, listen, this was part of the discussion before Congress took up the issue of impeachment. Part of the debate was, on one hand, you say there was concern about taking up this issue, one, out of some speculation about what the Senate might do. 2, it's a really divisive process that sucks up a lot of the oxygen, certainly within the press. And I think what you saw people conclude in the House was, what sort of message does this send to future presidents and to this president if they can take these kinds of actions without any repercussion? At the same time, now that it's in the Senate, there's also that acknowledgement of, what if they let him off the hook? What sort of message does that send to future presidents and to this president if this is not considered impeachable offenses? What is? And so that's a tricky needle to thread, right? So what do you do? And I think, at least on the House side, our determination was do what you think is right, and the Senate will do what the Senate does. He may get let off the hook, right? But the fact that he will be one of 3 presidents in American history to have been impeached in the House, I think is significant. And I think it's up to all of us as American citizens to also hold him to account, regardless of what the Senate does.
I was just going to say that last part, so I definitely agree.
We have time for one more question from the audience.
Oh, all right. Another off impeachment topic question, but open to both of you, I guess, as tech literate representatives, and mostly to Representative DelBene as an alumni of Microsoft, which faced its own antitrust action, settled with the federal government, and led to a really flourishing PC and software market in the past. If the Senate won't take bills on tech reform, like the policy bill that you mentioned earlier, people are scared to speak on what they don't understand. What extent do you, or can we expect to achieve meaningful tech reform? Do you feel antitrust will be necessary to a certain point, and what is so wrong with antitrust?
Well, let me say, on meaningful tech reform, I think the most kind of fundamental thing we can do is pass privacy legislation. People should be in control of their most personal, sensitive data, and that's foundational to so many things that are happening across the board and impacting people, not only in the United States, but around the world. So I take it one member of Congress at a time. Sit down, talk to them about why. Joni talked about states moving forward. States are going to move in the absence of the federal government doing anything, so that's a forcing function. But Europe is moving in the absence of the United States doing anything and has had pretty significant legislation. GDPR on privacy is moving forward on rules on AI. We even have debates happening on tax policy with respect to a digital world, because so much of our tax policy is based on physical goods and physical location, and now we've got to figure out how that changes. So there are other things forcing us to move forward, but I think we should be leaders. We're innovative. We're an innovative country. We've been innovators in these areas, and we should be thoughtful about what policy should look like, not only for domestic policy, but also be at the international table. So I'm going to keep pushing every individual member at a time to help educate them on these issues so we move forward, because as we talked about earlier, it's actually something that can be bipartisan. So this is going to take another type of effort. And when we talk about technology, some of the challenges of technology, when we look at things like facial recognition or artificial intelligence, that wave we should be talking about, and also that privacy foundation will be important, those aren't always big companies. So there are issues on antitrust that you can talk about too, but when we talk about some of the concerns about how technology used or what it might be doing, remember that antitrust isn't necessarily always going to be something that addresses those issues, and that's why it's so important that we have that Congress is weighing in and making sure we're putting the policies in place to look at, again, protecting human rights, civil rights, constitutional rights in a digital world. And it's going to take a push, but people have to feel it's a priority, and maybe that's the main thing, is people have got to feel a sense of urgency about it, so it gets a little higher on the list of things that needs to get done.
I'll chime in on the, where'd you go? I'll just chime in on the the first part of your question. And it gets at something that Susan and I are working on this select committee on the modernization of Congress, and really Susan has led the way on looking at some technology changes just in terms of building institutional capacity. You can go back to really the 90s under Speaker Gingrich and see a series of decisions that really demonstrate a self-lobotomy, where Congress eroded its capacity to deal with some of these issues. And so, for example, there was something called the Office of Technology Assessment, which was really meant to make Congress and members of Congress smarter about innovation, about contemporary technology issues. And that got nuked. And the downside of that is you see things like the social media, the Facebook hearings, where it sure looked like a whole bunch of members of the United States Senate had not a whole lot of knowledge on those issues. That was very diplomatic how I put that. And so, you have these really significant issues that Susan discussed around privacy, that you asked about in your question, and yet you have a Congress that really doesn't have the institutional capacity to deal with these issues that really affect the American people. And so some of the recommendations, and I give Susan a lot of credit, because some of the recommendations that we've passed have been about restoring some of that capacity to deal with tough issues. There's others too. I mean, and this gets at Joni's question around what are some of the things that you're doing. So some of the things that we're looking at also is like, how do you hang on to talented people who know a lot, right? There's not a position in Congress, either on committees or in individual offices, with a median tenure of longer than 3 years. And so when you see this like massive turnover in Congress by our staffs, the reason that impacts you all is that in the absence of institutional capacity of smart people who developed a knowledge base, what fills that void is the executive branch and lobbyists. And I would argue that does not serve your interests. That does not serve the interests of the American people. And so some of the proposals that we've made have been focused on, okay, how do you hang on? How do you recruit and retain a diversity of talented people? So these are some of the things that we're working on, and why that committee matters, and why the two of us are spending so much time on this. So it can get wonky and it can get in the weeds, but it can be consequential because it gets at the ability to even make any progress on some of these technical issues.
Yeah, we got to build the foundation, right?
Well, that concludes our discussion tonight. Thank you very much, Representative DelBene.
Thanks, everybody.